Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, please subscribe, ring the bell, like the video, and comment. Alright, so this is a continuation of our book club. We're reading Cosmos and Psyche, and I'll be reading the next section tonight out loud to you, and me. It will be my first time reading it. I don't know, sorry. Okay. This section is called the Interior Quest. So, let's see what it has in store. In the history of a culture, the inner history of a civilization can sometimes bear suggestive resemblances to the unfolding of an individual human life. In Joseph Campbell's classic description of the archetypal journey of the hero, the liberator, the shaman, the mystic, the creator, the discoverer of new worlds, a dramatic progression takes place that involves certain characteristic stages, a decisive separation from the community, detaching the self from the larger whole in which it has until then been embedded, an experience of the physical and spiritual life of the world as undergoing a great danger, an encroaching shadow, a fall into ruin, and a radical shift of emphasis from external realities to the interior realm, moving, quote, from the world scene of secondary effects to those causal zones of the psyche where the difficulties really reside. Wait, I feel like I skipped a sentence there. In Joseph Campbell's classic description of the archetypal journey of the hero, a dramatic progression takes place that involves certain characteristic stages, those stages being separation from community, detaching the self from a larger whole, the experience of the physical and spiritual life of the world. Oh, so this is an experience of the physical and spiritual life of the world. No, wait. I don't understand. This sentence is really crazy. There's a semicolon. I'm just going to move on because I don't think that sentence makes sense to me yet, right in this moment. Okay. There follows a dark night of the soul, an interior descent, bringing a crisis of meaning, a transformative encounter with human suffering and mortality, and a disorienting dissolution of the self's basic structures of identity and being. Only through such a descent does the hero penetrate to a source of greater knowledge and power opened by a direct experience of the archetypal dimension of life. Along the way of this perilous journey, certain humble clues and anomalies unexpectedly appear that challenge and destabilize the confident knowledge of the old self, yet ultimately point the way to the threshold of another world. In the dramatic evolution of the Western psyche, which has proven so consequential for the planet, the enduring archetypal patterns visible in the myths of the hero also seem to function with extraordinary potency at the level of history in the collective cultural psyche. But if so, the shift in context from myth to history, and from the individual person to a civilization, has involved a surprising change in the terms of the narrative. For in the history of Western thought and culture, the community and larger whole from which the heroic self was separated was not simply the local tribal or familial matrix, but rather the entire community of being, the earth and the cosmos itself. Different stages of such a separation, descent, and transformation have taken place in each great epoch of Western cultural history, in what in retrospect appears not unlike a vast evolutionary rite of passage played out on the stage of history in the cosmos, and now reaching an especially precarious moment of truth. For in the history of Western thought and culture, the community and larger whole from which the heroic self was separated was not simply the local unit, but rather the entire community of being in the earth and cosmos itself. Different stages of such a separation have taken place in each great epoch of Western cultural history, in what in retrospect appears not unlike a vast evolutionary rite of passage played out on the stage of history and the cosmos, and is now reaching an especially precarious moment of truth. We see such a pattern in late antiquity against the backdrop of classical civilization's ruinous decline, as the ancient cosmological vision eventually reached an opaque boundary within the overarching fixed structure of the geocentric Ptolemaic Aristotelian universe. The complexity of the celestial movements was seen as increasingly inscrutable, the power of the planetary spheres over human life increasingly all-determining. The cultural psyche could not penetrate farther under the established set of assumptions and was thereby forced to go within, to move deeply into the interior world of the human soul and spirit, and bring forth a new form of being. So it was at this moment, after the intense struggles and epiphanies of late biblical Judaism and early Christianity, Gnosticism, and the mystery religions, amidst the skeptical and religious crises of the late classical age, that there took place the great interior journey of St. Augustine. And then the entire medieval West he so profoundly influenced. And then of the entire medieval West he so profoundly influenced and anticipated. Oh my gosh, great. I need to learn more about all those things. I feel like that was a lot. So too in the modern world, but on a new scale and with more radical separation, as the larger implications of the Copernican revolution gradually emerged in the course of the modern era, the impenetrable boundaries of the disenchanted cosmic vision began again to force the cultural psyche into the interior. Pascal was among the first to confront the dark entailments of the new cosmic reality. Quote, "The eternal silence of these infinite spaces fills me with dread." Kant, though filled with wonder by those same spaces, struggled mightily to overcome the dark disjunction between, quote, "the starry heaven above me and the moral law within me," unquote. The realm of science and the realm of religion. Finally, Nietzsche fully recognized the plight of the modern self in the scientifically revealed cosmos, quote, "straying as though an infinite nothing," unquote, began his paradigmatic descent into the interior depths. Thus, he foreshadowed the depth psychology that was conceived and developed in the immediate aftermath of that descent by Freud and Jung in Europe, and in a different but closely related mode by William James in America. Against the historical background of a great crisis, both inner and outer, that overtook modern civilization, the 20th century became, as Peter Hammons has observed, quote, "the psychological century," unquote. It was Freud who first recognized the deep affinity and continuity linking the Copernican revolution with the depth psychology revolution. I don't know about the depth psychology revolution. As the former event had irrevocably transformed the outer cosmos, so the latter irrevocably transformed the inner cosmos, in each case radically overturning humankind's naive conviction of its centricity as the price for radically enlarging the compass of its vision. Just as the Copernicans had displaced the Earth from the center of the universe to reveal a much larger unknown cosmos of which the Earth was now but a tiny peripheral fragment, the Freudians displaced the conscious self from the center of the inner universe to reveal the much larger unknown realm of the unconscious. The modern self had to acknowledge that it was not master of its own house, as the confident Cartesian oh my gosh, I don't know how to say that word. I guess cognition. Cogito, it's Latin, I guess, has implied the modern self has to acknowledge that it's not the master of its own house, but was rather a peripheral epiphenomenon of far more powerful processes working unfathomed beyond the boundaries of its awareness. that is something I agree with. Let's say that one again for the camera. The modern self has to acknowledge that it was not the master of its own house, but was rather a peripheral epiphenomenon of far more powerful processes working unfathomed beyond the boundaries of its awareness. Okay, so this paragraph is just saying that, the Copernican revolution sort of unveiled the cosmos to us, the outer depths, and that, the psychology movement in the 20th century did something similar for the interior world or inner depth. In both revolutions, cosmological and psychological were simultaneously decentering and emancipatory, but where Copernicus's came as the modern self began its great ascent, with Leonardo and Columbus, Luther and Montaigne, Bacon and Galileo, Descartes and Newton. By contrast, Freud's emerged at the other end of the trajectory as the modern self began its great descent, with Nietzsche and Weber, Kafka, Picasso, Heidegger and Wittgenstein, Woolf, Beauvoir, Camus and Beckett. The two revolutions heralded, as it were, the dawn and sunset of the modern self's solar journey. While the Copernican revolution impelled and symbolized the outward moving ascent and construction of the modern self that had begun in the Renaissance and brought forth the Enlightenment, the depth psychological revolution reflected the inward-turning descent and deconstruction of the self that commenced at the end of the 19th century and brought forth the postmodern era. That was really well said. I've never, thought it like that. I never actually had that thought before, and it makes a lot of sense to me, practical sense. I don't know, it just makes, it's a really good way to put it. I think that paragraph was clear compared to the other ones to me. Okay, this arc-like symmetry revealed itself in yet another important way. For each revolution was also both disenchanting and spiritually renewing in its effects, whereas the Copernican awakening of outward ascent began with an ambiance of spiritual exaltation and then moved gradually but inexorably toward the random and mechanistic universe of the latter modern worldview, the unfolding of the depth psychology revolution of inward descent enacted rather the reverse sequence. Freud, by temperament and intellectual commitment, emphasized from the start the disenchanting implications of the psychological awakening. All psychic motivation rooted in unconscious biological instinct, all human experience and aspiration, no matter how elevated or sublime, reduced finally to mechanistic impulse. Yet even Freud, in the poetic and mythic cast of his vision and his enduring emotional investments in archaic numinosity, parentheses, classical mythology, dream interpretation, ancient religious icons, cultic secrecy. Yet even Freud, in the poetic and mythic cast of his vision and his enduring emotional investment in the archaic numinosity, betrayed signs of an underlying ambivalence. James and Jung, however, with different sensibilities from Freud's, pointed decisively to more spiritually expansive potentials of the new discoveries and ultimately to a vaster and more mysterious inner universe than Freud had been able to acknowledge. Like the Copernican revolution, depth psychology resulted from the extraordinary convergence of a multiplicity of intellectual and cultural streams and proved to be just as generative and paradoxical in its developing vision. Then there's a little section separator. So this is second part of this part. Of all the fields and disciplines of the modern intellectual world, it was uniquely depth psychology, by the very nature of its historical moment, its cultural sources, and its therapeutic aims, that located itself at the precise intersection of the two great polarities of the modern sensibility, the Enlightenment and Romanticism. If you remember from before, there was a section about the Enlightenment and Romanticism and how there's kind of a polarity between them, between rational and poetic, I guess you could say. I'm not sure. Let's continue. With roots nourished by both streams being enlightenment and romanticism, like psychology, dream is about dream interpretation, all that stuff, and it's also about like analyzing the mind, I guess, and I'm not sure. That's what I get so far. It was inspired not only by scientific principles of Norton and Darwin, but also by imaginative aspirations of Emerson. Hence, the promise it held for so many as a via regia for healing the schisms of the modern self. Not sure what that means. That's another Latin term, but I guess for a lot of people in the 20th century, depth psychology revolution was promising to heal that kind of schism that is underlying in modern thought between self and other. So let's continue. Depth psychology took up the enduring passions and concerns of the Romantic project, exploring the depths of consciousness and the unconscious, emotion and instinct, memory, imagination, visions, dreams, myth, art, creativity. It pursued introspection to new heights and abysses, examined the psyche, shadows, and pathologies, discerned hidden motivations, ambivalence, and ambiguity. It studied the mysteries of religious experience, ancient rituals and shamanic initiations, mystical revelations and Gnostic doctrines, esoteric traditions and divinatory practices, the wisdom and visions of many other cultures and other ages. All this it did with an Enlightenment commitment to lucid rational analysis and systematic investigation, as it sought therapeutically effective knowledge in a context of collective empirical research. Throughout their lives, James, Freud, and Jung pressed the scientific mind beyond its conventional limits to engage realities known by visionaries and poets, mystics, and initiates. Striving to combine the intellectual rigor of scientific observation with the intuitive insight of the poetic and spiritual imagination, depth psychology attempted to bring the light of reason to the depth mysteries of human interiority. It often witnessed the converse, the light of reason reevaluated, transformed, and deepened by that very mysteries it sought to illuminate. Moreover, as especially Jung understood, depth psychology engaged with Enlightenment's epistemological challenge sent by Kant, as it attempted to discern deep structural principles that inform human subjectivity, those enduring patterns and forms that unconsciously permeate and configure human knowledge and experience. Yet, contrary to Kant's narrow list of a priori categories, those underlying forms were repeatedly discovered, beginning with Nietzsche and Freud, and above all by Jung and his successors, to be mythic, symbolic, even numinous in nature. We're going to look up that word now. Let's see. It's been mentioned too many times. Numinous, having a strong religious or spiritual quality, indicating or suggesting the presence of a divinity. Oh, that's me. Numinous. I'm numinous. Let's change my, Twitter name to... Sorry, everyone, this is a break. I'm just changing my name online to Numinous Shell. Okay, perfect. Okay, back to the game here. Where were we? It's just the word numinous is everywhere. Okay, let's see here. It's like, yes, obviously, like Freudian psychology is sort of like a queer religious thing. So let's continue. With depth psychology, reason revealed ever-expanding and deepening interior realities that challenged reason's compass. The very nature of those disclosures ultimately subverted Freud's reductionist Enlightenment assumptions and moved the modern mind from James to Jung onward to engage and assimilate dimensions of consciousness and principles of the subjective universe that could no longer be easily accommodated by what James saw as the prematurely closed universe of conventional scientific belief. Just as depth psychology subverted the naive orthodoxies of the scientific mind while extending the range of scientific inquiry, so it subverted the naive orthodoxies of traditional religion while extending the range of spiritual inquiry. The relationship of depth psychology to religion was complex. The directions opened by both James and Jung pointed toward the human universality of spiritual aspiration, contrary to the secularist assumptions of much modern thought, and provided new grounds for affirming the religious dimension of life as essential to psychological health and wholeness. Insights into transcultural archetypal structures underlying the world's religions brought new understanding to the human quest for spiritual meaning. That understanding proved to be both enriching and relativizing. On the one hand, it undermined absolutist claims by various religious traditions to unique spiritual authority, thus freeing many individuals from their dogmatic chains while honoring their spiritual quests. That's nice. On the other hand, the new insights also made possible for many an unexpected spiritual renewal and deepening of relationship to the central symbols of those same traditions, now seen and understood in a larger, less literal, more directly meaningful and experiential vivid light. Nice. Especially affected were those many spiritual seekers whose experience of the sacred no longer readily fit with the structures of their inherited religious tradition, a phenomenon increasingly widespread in the late modern and postmodern era. For these, depth psychology provided new ways of articulating their encounter with the numinous, affirmed the many fruitful sources of spiritual disclosure from which the human psyche could draw beyond those sanctioned by a particular religion. Non-ordinary states of consciousness, creativity, dreams, intimate relationships, sexuality in the body, nature, sacred traditions, and transformative practices from other eras and cultures. Like science, religion possessed its own tendencies towards reifying a prematurely closed interpretation of the universe. Depth psychology offered an evolving frame of reference that opened the horizon of authentic religious experience to engage the mysteries of human existence beyond the constraints and mutual antagonisms widely characteristic of the world's religious traditions. Given the modern mind's radical division between self and world, and between conscious and unconscious, the continuing centrality in 20th century thought of depth psychology can be recognized as, in some sense, inevitable. For the radiant emergence of the modern rational self, the highly focused, centered, empowered, detached, objectifying, self-reflective, and self-identifying Cartesian consciousness, effectively constellated and unconscious, as light creates shadow, which then needed to be theorized, explored, and painstakingly integrated. The discovery of the unconscious was thus significant on many fronts, with multiple implications needing to be addressed, not only psychological and therapeutic, but cultural and historical, philosophical, political, existential, spiritual. Jung described that significance in the strongest possible terms, quote, "We have not understood yet that the discovery of the unconscious means an enormous spiritual task, which must be accomplished if we wish to preserve our civilization." Question, do we wish to preserve our civilization? And now this is the final section of the section. The fate of depth psychology was nevertheless problematic throughout the 20th century. It provided the modern mind with a host of irreplaceable insights and concepts, from the discovery of the unconscious itself, both personal and collective, to the understanding of the ego's various mechanisms of defense, the psyche's symbolic modes of expression, and the dynamics of psychospiritual transformation. But because the larger cultural worldview within which depth psychology was embedded continued to sustain the basic schism between human self and disenchanted world, the reintegration and healing of the modern psyche could only go so far. So why could the healing and reintegration of the modern psyche only go so far in depth psychology? It was because the larger cultural worldview within which depth psychology was embedded continued to sustain the basic schism between human self and disenchanted world. The problem was indirectly reflected in criticism from scientific disciplines indifferent or antagonistic to the Romantic project that charged depth psychology with an alleged lack of objectivity and empirically measurable results. Men love empirically measurable results. Men believe that success is proven through empirical, measurable results. That is what validates their doing. Okay, so these scientific critiques were effectively refuted by psychologists as well as by philosophers such as Habermas, who affirmed depth psychology's emancipatory potential through deepened self-understanding. In contrast with the physical sciences, its essential focus was on meanings that can never be quantified. Yet the discipline continued to be constrained by a more encompassing problem. Its insights were apparently relevant only to the psyche, to the subjective aspect of things, and not to the world in itself. Those insights could not change the larger cosmic context within the human being sought psychological integrity and spiritual fulfillment. That primal rupture remained untouched and unhealed. Oh, my friend just sent me a really nice message on Instagram. Thanks, Melanie. Shout out to Melanie. Okay. Let us continue. We're almost done here. 2 more minutes. Within the established structure of the modern worldview, no matter how subjectively convincing might be the psychological evidence for a transcendent spiritual dimension, an archetypal realm, an anima mundi, a universal religious impulse, or the existence of God, the discoveries of psychology could reveal nothing with certainty about the actual constitution of reality. That is a good one. We believe in a transcendent spiritual dimension. We believe in an archetypal realm. We believe in an anima mundi, a universal religious impulse. Okay, continue. The experiences and inner knowledge explored by depth psychology could be regarded only as an expression of the human psyche and its intrinsic structures. Human spirituality and religion were still in effect confined to the subjective universe. What existed beyond this could not be said. Depth psychology had perhaps rendered a deeper and richer inner world for the modern soul, but the objective universe known by natural science was still materialistically opaque and purposeless. With the chasm in the modern world view between religious, romantic, and depth psychological interiority on the one hand, and on the other hand, the mechanistic world picture of the physical sciences. There appeared to be no possibility for an authentic bridge or mediation between self and world, subject and object, psyche and cosmos. At its core and essence, modernity has constellated a seemingly irresolvable tension of opposites, a fundamental antithesis between the objectivist cosmology and a subjectivist psychology. The great descent of the modern self had reached an apparently intractable impasse. Extending into and permeating every aspect of human experience, this metaphysical and epistemological predicament in one form or another engaged virtually every major thinker of the 20th century. Many courageous responses to this encompassing dilemma emerged in the course of that century, some resigned to its inevitability, others anticipating its transformation. Among the latter, from within the field of depth psychology itself, the study of one provocative category of phenomenon in particular has suggested with special directness that chasmic division between interior self and objective world might not be absolute. Loving it. If you guys didn't realize so far, this book is, I think it's astrology propaganda. It's drawing a narrative about human history. I think it's going to make a case for, how healthy astrology is, I think, maybe. So let's think about what happened in that chapter. We learned about depth psychology, the ascent, the post-Copernican ascent, and then the psychological descent of the modern subject. Now we live in a postmodern world. And the subjectivity of today and tomorrow is still being wrought, but it didn't get into that. It didn't get about the future. It was all about, about the depth psychology and Freudian thought. Okay, well, I hope you guys enjoyed that. I know I did, and I'm looking forward to doing the next one, and this is a great way for me to read, so if you made it this far, you're a real one, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day or night.